Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Almost siesta time, keeping in mind we're an hour ahead, which is a very important time in the Maltese cultural lifestyle. But obviously, as lecturers and students, we're still very busy at this time of the year. So I welcome especially today the fourth-year students and a number of other guests that we have here, and Professor Charles Galdis, who just came in. We welcome our distinguished guests and our special speaker, our keynote speaker, Professor Hilary Bambrick. And I would like to welcome also Mr. Tim Davis, who is the Deputy High Commissioner. And we thank him for making this possible, for the High Commission's support for this event. And I would like also to express my congratulations also for the support you gave yesterday's event at Verdala Palace. And this would be like a continuity, actually, of it. It's branching out in the academic sector. So thank you all for coming. And we hope that it will be an interesting session for us all. Not we hope, we are sure, and we hope that you also engage in a lively, interactive discussion after the presentations, because at the end of the day, this is what makes our events special and memorable. So basically, I would like to highlight that the linkages between climate change and health issues have always been very much in the forefront. As being involved in this process for a very long time, I have always found utmost support from the Health Ministry to push our messages forward in the sense of how urgent it is to take action on climate change. And the linkages also with other health issues like air quality, like water quality, for example, food security, food hygiene, are very important topics. But also particularly important in the health sector, the health connections and linkages and climate change always point this out, is the issue of vulnerability, especially us as citizens and us as part of the community. We are always faced at some stage in our lives with meeting people who are more vulnerable. Sometimes it is us ourselves who are in a more vulnerable state as a result of the effects of climate change, or rather, besides the negative effects of climate change, sometimes it could be even the effects on changes that society requires to address climate change. And it is with this background that we are sure that this debate today will be very interesting. We have a keynote speaker who is on the forefront in research with respect to climate change adaptation and health issues. We have two PhD students who will also provide their input. We have Dr. Julian Mamo, who is with us here today and who will be helping us to understand better the implications which climate change have on health and health issues and our daily lives in this respect. And so we augur you a very interesting time, but more than anything, your interactivity is very important. So we rely on your interventions and your suggestions, your proposals, and your, why not, uncomfortable questions. And with that, I pass on the word to Mr. Davies.
Thank you, Professor Borges. Distinguished members of the panel and ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to today's seminar to introduce Professor Hilary Bambrick. It's great to see so many of you here taking time out of your studies, but I'm sure you'll get a lot out of the seminar today. First of all, I would like to thank the University of Malta and Professor Borges for hosting the seminar today, and to her excellent team at the Climate Change Research Platform, in particular Dr. Stefano Moncada for putting the event together today. Once again, it has been great to partner with the University of Malta and I hope that the Australian High Commission and the University have many more occasions to collaborate on meaningful and worthy events in the future. Thank you also to Professor Bambrick for visiting Malta and being involved in the many events that the University and the President's Foundation for the Wellbeing of Society and the High Commission have planned for you while you're here. Hope you get some time off as well. For those that don't know, Professor Bambrick is Head of School at the School of Public Health and Social Work at the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. Her research focuses on the health impacts of climate variability and change, especially on more vulnerable populations and climate adaptation to improve health. In addition to her academic work, she is an international consultant on climate change adaptation for the World Health Organization and also consults for governments in Australia and overseas. Underpinning her work is a commitment to reducing inequalities and sustaining the environment on which we depend, and thus her work intersects with social and environmental justice and human rights. To give you an idea of how far Professor Bambrick has travelled to be with us today, if you drilled a hole from Malta to the precise location on the other side of the world, you would come out about 400 kilometres southeast of Brisbane in the Pacific Ocean. That's a lot further than those that came on the bus from Birkirkara today. I do send my apologies from the High Commissioner Julianne Hintz. She arrived back in Malta today, but she's in yesterday, but she's in Gozo today, making an introductory call on the Minister for Gozo. Now, I thought, as the University of Malta hosts the Islands and Small State Institute, I thought that I would share with you some observations on the impact of climate change and environmental factors on another small island state, Kiribati, where I lived for 2.5 years during the second of my 5 diplomatic postings. Does anyone know where Kiribati is? It's spelled Kiribati when you see it written, and it used to be the Gilbert Islands, but it's in the Central Pacific where the equator and the international dateline meet. So kind of halfway between Fiji and Hawaii, just a few dots of islands there. It's made up of 34 atolls, coral atolls and reef islands, spread over 3.5 million square kilometres, and has a population of just over 110,000. The atoll that I lived on was the capital, Tarawa. So Tarawa is actually larger than Malta. It's 500 square metres compared to Malta's 316 square metres, kilometres. However, being a low-lying coral atoll, the size of Tarawa reduces from 500 square kilometres at low tide to only 140 square kilometres at high tide. So that's a reduction of about 2/3 of its size twice a day when the tide comes in and out. The highest point above sea level is only 3 metres, which is probably the height of this room. The island is shaped like a narrow horseshoe with one road and is so narrow in some parts that at my house I could stand on the lagoon side of the house and throw a rock over the house into the ocean on the other side. Being so low-lying, Tarawa and the surrounding islands are very vulnerable to any rise in sea level caused by climate change or tropical storm surges. Although it's hard to monitor exactly how much the sea level has risen in Tarawa, the higher frequency of tropical storms throughout the Pacific Ocean is devastating to the well-being of these communities, particularly in the case where a storm surge coincides at the same time as a king tide. I can remember a time when this happened, when I was there, and seawater washed into some villages, flushing away everything that they had that they couldn't elevate into the small huts that they would sleep in. The effect on their health and nutrition is also at risk and a big factor, as the ground is mostly coral sand and it's hard to grow nutritional plants, and where people had been able to plant crops, if the salt water washed over the plants, then that would spoil the plants. The problem is not helped by illegal sand mining, where sand is taken from beaches at night to be mixed with concrete and made into building blocks. The blocks are then sold to make seawalls and higher dwellings to protect villages from the seawater. The sand mining creates erosion and only brings the sea even closer to the villages. Other environmental concerns facing the Kiribati are how to dispose of waste and sewage in a small location without creating landfills that could potentially compromise the very limited freshwater tables that they have. Australia is Kiribati's largest bilateral donor and is helping to meet these challenges by improving its environmental resilience as well as its economic education and health prospects. One project that we worked off when I was there was to encourage recycling. As a result, recycled materials was one of Kiribati's biggest exports back to Australia, after fish and coconut oil. So if you ever get a chance to visit Kiribati, I recommend it. It's a stunning part of the world. So I hope you enjoy the seminar and Professor Bambrick's keynote address, and come out with some fruitful seeds for some worthwhile solutions. And good luck to all the students in your dissertations and your exams. Okay.
As chair of the climate platform, I would like to extend my thanks to Stefano for his sterling work and his team, and for making all this possible. I think a round of applause would be very, very important. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So I also have to thank all of you and Romina and all the others who have helped us so far. So I would like to, just load the presentation and ask Professor Bambrick to join me here on the floor and to leave her the floor. Just a few words. Hilary and I have been working together for some years. Also together with Dr. Marie Bergoglio is here in the audience, and thank you for coming also, dear students. We've been working exactly on these issues of vulnerability and resilience, and looking at how small vulnerable communities are being impacted by climate change, and what is the policy response as well. Now, we've done some of this work in Ethiopia, and with Professor Bambrick, we've been trying to assess the vulnerability and the possible response and resilience also in Kiribati and in other parts of the Pacific. We plan to do this also in other parts and in other areas, and the work that Professor Bambrick has been doing and is going to be presenting today falls exactly in the area where we would like to expand our research in developed countries, this time like Malta, assessing the responsiveness, so whether countries are prepared or what they're doing in terms of climate change adaptation when it comes to the consequences of climate change in relation to health. So without further ado, thank you once again from the University of Malta, the Climate Change Platform, to all the players who have helped us to organizing this, and the floor is yours. Do you prefer to use this or that one?
I've been told I have to use this one.
Yeah, is it?
It's on. You can hear me, yes? Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Stefano. Well, welcome everybody this afternoon. Thank you all very much for coming. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you were at the presentation I gave yesterday? Oh, okay. Well, forgive me for the first few slides, because you're going to get a little bit of a rehash of what we had yesterday as I set the scene, and you're also going to get the same jokes. So if you could laugh on cue, I'd really appreciate it. Thanks very much. Okay, I promise it won't all be the same. We'll just warm up into it. So I'm here to talk about how we manage extreme events. And in particular, I'm going to give you a bit of an Australian perspective, because that's what I know best in terms of the health system and other systems that interact with health, and how we cope with extreme events. But then we're going to move on to sort of you talking, if you like, and you telling me what goes on in Malta and how we can possibly manage extreme events that happen in Malta. So I'll give you some tools to use as we go through. I'm very happy too, if there's a question you want to ask along the way, just stand up, wave your arms about, that kind of thing, or we can save them till the end. Okay. Thanks very much. Okay, so those of you who were there yesterday have seen this. I'm talking about where Brisbane is. This is where I'm living at the moment. I've been there for a few months now. I arrived in January, which was peak summertime, incredibly hot, very humid. Brisbane's in the state of Queensland in Australia, and to give you a sense of scale, Queensland, you can fit 5,500 Maltas into Queensland. So that gives you a sense of how big an area we're talking about. Queensland takes up, it's about a quarter of the country, so sort of imagine, 30,000 Maltas. 2.1 million people live in Brisbane, so it's a big city. It's located in a swamp, really, but otherwise known as the river. And we do have some beautiful vegetation around as well. So this is actually taken in the City Botanic Gardens. There's actually a kookaburra in there somewhere if you look closely. But might be a bit hard to see. Brisbane climate, so subtropical. It's very warm, very humid in summer, and it's stunning the rest of the year. It's basically as lovely as it gets. However, just last week we did have the leftovers of a tropical cyclone, and this is me sweeping water out of my bedroom. So I think we did get quite a bit of flooding in Brisbane. My house is actually up on a hill, so it was very lucky. It was just inundated with some water rushing down the hill. Some areas weren't so lucky. Oh, and I've thrown this one in. Everyone talks about Australian wildlife and how sort of scary it is. This is what washed up in the floods last week. So it was found in the street. Don't go swimming in floodwaters was the message that came out of that. But a little bit more seriously, there was some extreme flooding that happened last week, and this is the town of Lismore in New South Wales, and most of it ended up underwater. So what happened was we had this tropical cyclone that came in from the very north of Queensland. It stopped being a tropical cyclone and just became a very intense low pressure system carrying lots and lots of rain. It moved very slowly down the coast and dumped a whole lot of water. So that was just last week. Now, in terms of sort of flow-on effects, the headline here in the conversation, Tropical Cyclone Debbie has blown a hole in the winter vegetable supply. That's because the areas that it hit were major food-producing regions in North Queensland. So it wiped out 75% of major vegetable crops for Australia. So probably we'll all be eating baked beans, I think, for this coming winter. Not a lot of vegetables left. So this is the sort of thing we're going to have to get used to. Climate is shifting, the norms are changing. We're seeing changes in averages, but also changes in extremes as well, which is what we're here to talk about today. So we'll get less cold weather and more hot weather. There's also much more water contained in the atmosphere as well. And so you end up with sort of a supercharged climate system, if you like, one that can have much more intense rainfall events, stronger winds, higher temperatures. Now, to give a little bit of a sense that I'm not making this up, so we've had 15 of the hottest 16 years have happened since 2000. So things are getting hotter, and every year we're breaking records again and again. So some notable events that have happened around the world recently. If you can imagine living in temperatures that reached 50 degrees on the thermometer scale, but a feels-like temperature of 74 because of the humidity in the air. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't imagine what that must feel like. So we're getting beyond the limits of where humans can actually live. In the US, winter before last, that was actually the year without winter, was how it was described. So temperatures were 5 degrees above average. Around a similar time, we had Australia's endless summer. So we had temperatures that were 12 degrees above the average in March, which is autumn time. We had the hottest April day on record for Sydney, which was 34 degrees. So that's mid-autumn, and it was 34, which is pretty warm. Like, that's a hot summer's day for Sydney. This year, more recently, we had an unprecedented length of heatwave in a town called Moree in New South Wales, where they had over 50 consecutive days above 35 degrees. So it's not giving people a chance to cool down and to relax. So if you're talking to people from Moree who might be working outdoors, for example, they're easily going through 5 litres of water a day. And the previous record number of days was 19. So you can see that that's a huge, huge change. This is Cyclone Winston, which occurred in the Pacific in February last year, and it was one of the most intense, or it was the most intense storm that has occurred in that region ever. So it was a Category 5 cyclone, which is as bad as they get. I won't run through all of these, but just to give you a sense of that these extreme events are happening all over the world, and they're happening all the time, so increasingly frequently. And there are all sorts of different sorts of extremes: rainfall extremes, cyclones, fires. These climate extremes are actually very, very expensive. So severe weather events over the last decade has cost the US $443 billion. And it's cost China $265 billion. So I've just picked those two out. And I'm going to talk about particular events in Australia and how much they've cost as well a little bit later on. So it gives you a sense of the scale of the damage that gets done during these events. If you want to read out more, the Climate Council, of which I'm a member, they've been putting out some excellent reports lately on extreme weather events. And I suggest you can visit their website just down there if you're interested in reading out more about what's happening in Australia, but also around the world. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to focus on Australia. So having a quick look at how climate change is going to affect Australia, or is actually currently affecting Australia. We have cyclones that occur up north, so in Queensland and also Western Australia, also in the Northern Territory, which is in the middle as well. So all across the top at risk from cyclones. Down in this area here, it's increasingly high fire risk and increasing drought as well. More severe rain events, which is like what we saw last week in Brisbane and northern New South Wales, southern Queensland, all those sorts of things there. What's really important about this particular drought symbol here is this is our major wheat producing area, and what's happening here is we're actually, our wheat crops are declining in Australia. Just that's also very important here, this is our major wine producing region, so we don't want too much going on down there as well. Okay, so when we talk about extreme events and climate change, people ask whether a particular event can be caused by climate change. And the answer, and so what we're actually talking about now is probability and attribution. And what we're becoming increasingly sure of is that these events would not be happening if the climate hadn't already changed to some degree. So they're happening in an atmosphere that is warmer and wetter. It's supercharged, if you like. And for those of you who saw this yesterday, this is explaining that idea of probability, which is those events are becoming much more frequent. So this was a satirical headline put out after some yet more major floods that had occurred in eastern Australia. Okay, so a little bit of a background now. In Australia, we're very used to these sorts of climate extremes. It's part of our national culture, our national identity, that we're actually we feel that we're resilient to these sorts of things. And in fact, 1908, Dorothea McKellar wrote a poem, "I love a sunburnt country, a land of sweeping plains, of ragged mountain ranges, of droughts and flooding rains." And that really gives a sense of what Australia has always been like, if you like. But what's happening is that those events are becoming much more extreme, and they're actually becoming less and less manageable. Now, Australia is the largest per capita emitter of greenhouse gas, and we're in the top 20 overall. The reason we're so high is we have lots of coal, we dig it up, we burn it, we export it to be burnt elsewhere, and also agriculture in Australia is a major producer of greenhouse gases. We have a population of 24 million people. We're getting older, so median age is 37 years. I think it's somewhat younger in Malta, is that right? Not too much? No? Still okay, on par? But similar to Malta, we're very highly urbanised. So 90% of Australians live around the coast in major cities. So we've got this, enormous land, but most of it's empty. Okay, so talking about climate change risks to health in Australia, what are we talking about? What sorts of health impacts are we expecting to see? Or that we're seeing already? So extreme heat, so the more direct impacts, the primary impacts, extreme heat, people end up in hospital. bushfires. I took this photo out my front door where I was living in Wollongong just a couple of years ago. We had some fires just come up one afternoon, as they do. So that was late afternoon. And we also have severe storms, so flooding causing drownings, severe wind events, people might get hit by somebody's roof, that sort of thing. So it's injuries related to storms. So they're the direct effects from climate change. Less direct effects, so ones that sort of go through some sort of a mediator. We have vector-borne disease, so vectors, mosquitoes, ticks, and so on. Respiratory disease, asthma and allergy. I mentioned yesterday the thunderstorm asthma event, and for those of you who missed it, this is something that happened in Melbourne last year. The temperatures had been warmer than normal, there was a massive thunderstorm, and many, many people became very ill, critically ill with respiratory symptoms, because when you get, not quite sure exactly how this happens, but a thunderstorm can burst pollen grains, and they get inhaled, they become small, they get inhaled more deeply. And it caused significant breathing difficulties for many people. So there were 2,000 extra ambulance call-outs, 8,000 people turning up to hospital, and 9 people died. So completely unprecedented. Gastroenteric disease, so food and waterborne diseases, salmonella, E. coli. So if you think about food you've left out on the bench, if it's a bit warmer, those bacteria multiply more quickly, or even on your kitchen cooking implements. Mental health is another issue with climate change. So depression and suicide, we know, increase with drought in Australia, in rural areas. Obesity and chronic disease, related to how much physical activity you're doing. So if it's a bit warm, you might go out less. And also related to the types of food that you're eating. If you're not being able to rely on fresh produce, for example. One thing to keep in mind about climate change impacts and climate change impacts on health is that they don't affect everybody equally. So some people are more vulnerable than others, some countries are more vulnerable than others, some areas within countries are more vulnerable than other areas. I've put up a list here of particular groups that are vulnerable in Australia, and some of those relate to Malta as well. So people who are chronically ill, less mobile, more likely to be hospitalised during heat waves, for example, as are people who are less socially connected. So if you're older and ill and socially isolated, nobody's checking up on you during a heat wave to make sure you're okay, you're more likely to get sick. Okay, so talking about what we're doing in terms of adaptation planning in Australia. So we know these events are happening, we know we need to do something about it. There's actually very little awareness amongst health service planners about climate change. We're very much focused on the ageing population. We know people are getting older, we know we're going to have to provide extra services for our ageing population. But they're also focused on short-term funding cycles, and they're not well prepared for climate change. And by being not well prepared, I mean that there's no sort of buffers built into the system to be able to suddenly take an influx of people on a very hot day, for example, with the thunderstorm asthma event. And just infrastructure as well, so buildings that may not be built to withstand floods, for example. Okay, so I'm going to run through a few recent events that actually expose some of the vulnerabilities in Australia's health system, and we'll work through a few of those. So in 2009 we had an extreme heat event in Melbourne where 48.8 was the highest state maximum temperature. In Melbourne itself it was reached 45. A friend of mine who was living there at the time described it as her eyelashes were melting if she stepped outside. That was sort of how it felt. It was that sort of really extreme temperatures. And they had 3 consecutive days over 43 degrees. Now what happens when you have a series of days in a row is that your bodies don't get a chance to get rid of that excess heat. In particular, it's a problem if the nighttime minimum temperatures are also quite high. So if you've got a hot day and the nights cool down, you can open up your windows, cool off, it's not so bad. But if those nighttime minimums don't allow you to cool off, or if your house is holding the heat, or if you live in a neighbourhood where you don't want to open the windows, all these things contribute to vulnerability to heat. So things that happened in Melbourne, we had significant power outages. People had to be evacuated from some buildings. There were people who had to be rescued from lifts that had broken down. So there was no air conditioning, the power had gone, and they're stuck in lifts. The transport system shut down because the train tracks buckled. Lots of sporting events were cancelled. I believe the tennis was cancelled. And thousands of people had to be treated. So there was an increase. There was 200 extra deaths that occurred in that time. And these weren't deaths that just happened a little earlier than they would have otherwise. These were 200 extra deaths. And what that meant was we didn't have the capacity to deal with the bodies. In terms of how much it cost, about $100 million. Relatedly, we had the Black Saturday bushfires that happened in Victoria. This is Australia's worst bushfire disaster, and it's not that long ago. And so during this time, we had that extreme heat that had happened, and we had even more extreme heat that followed on. And it caused, the conditions were just incredibly severe for a bushfire, and all these fires started up, and they could not be controlled. 173 people were killed, and many structures were destroyed. Many people were were displaced. Now, what happens when you get severe fire weather is you actually get and a large enough fire, the fire starts to generate its own weather, its own wind. And so we had here 100 kilometres an hour, 100 kilometre an hour winds that were going on. So it was hot, gusty conditions, incredibly dry conditions, and it was very easy for the land to catch fire. So since then, we've actually changed the way that we deal with fires in Australia. So before this, it used to be that you'd stay and you would defend your property, you'd defend your home. And now, if the weather is severe enough, they just tell you to get out. Okay, so obviously other impacts as well. So 12,000 livestock were killed. It affected a number of food crops and a number of other parks and reserves and so on. Now, this is much more recent, so this was just February just passed, and it was described, this was in New South Wales, so a state just below Queensland, and north of Victoria, so sandwiched in between those two. It was described as bad as it gets. We had those sort of unprecedented fire weather conditions in Victoria in February, in New South Wales in February. And this is the quote from the Rural Fire Service Commissioner speaking that day. So if you're caught out in the open under these sorts of conditions, you're likely to die. So they're not mincing words. They're really making it clear that these are extreme conditions. Okay, moving on to something a little bit different. Dengue in Queensland. We get outbreaks every year in northern Queensland. Usually a tourist brings it in or somebody coming home brings it in, and you get a small outbreak. But every now and then you get an uncontrolled outbreak, and that can be due to increased mosquito breeding from particular climate conditions at the time. One of the interesting things about dengue is that it looks like we're actually helping to fuel epidemics by an adaptation option that people have taken to climate change, which is to install water tanks. So domestic water tanks. So if you've got a water tank, it has to be very well maintained or it becomes a mosquito breeding ground. So we had the floods last week in Queensland. We also had some more severe floods a few years ago. And this was a very significant event where 38 people actually died in Queensland when a wall of water came rushing through a town. It was completely unexpected. Obviously people knew it had been raining and that they should be careful of the flooding, but they weren't expecting this water to just come rushing down the street as in the form of an inland tsunami. So 90 towns and 200,000 people were affected. So just to give you a sense of the scale of some of these events. It was estimated to have cost $2.4 billion directly, but it reduced the national GDP by $40 billion. And one thing that followed after that was there was an income tax levy put on for that year to recover some of the cost for rebuilding those areas, and I'll talk about issues with that later. Drought, we had a very long drought in Australia as well. This isn't so much an extreme event in terms of disasters, hospitals, something happening like this straight away, but it does still have significant impacts on people's health, in particular on the types of foods that people can buy, how expensive those foods are, and as I mentioned before, depression and suicide as well. I'm really giving you a sense of Australia as a scary place to live. We had these extreme storms happen recently too in South Australia, where we basically had a cyclone happening down south which just shouldn't happen. This is the first time this had happened. So we had 140 km/h winds. It took out the electricity distribution system, so basically knocked down the towers. And this is actually a picture of Adelaide at night, so the capital city of South Australia. And they lost power for some days. So, you know, while it was unprecedented, some politicians described it as unremarkable, just a storm. So, anyway. Okay, so how are we doing for time? Whoa, better get a bigger one. Okay, extreme heat in the health system, how well prepared can we be? I thought I'd focus on heat. You know, I've shown you all the variety of sorts of events that we can have, but heat is the one where you get these things you can actually plan for to some degree, and it is something that is of great importance to Australia, and it's something that I can imagine could be of increasing importance in Malta as well. So we are seeing that capital cities in Australia are all experiencing hotter weather. Heat waves are starting earlier, and we're getting more days each year that are hot. Those of you yesterday would have seen this one as well. Temperatures in Australia are changing, are recognised to be changing, so that we've actually added 2 more colours to our weather maps, just to be able to show, to be able to measure, to be able to show the temperatures that we're getting over 50 degrees. Okay, so obviously if you live in a warm place, you're kind of used to that warm weather, and you're less likely to be affected by heat that might affect somebody in another place. So just to give you an example, these are mortality graphs that were calculated for the different states in Australia. Now Queensland, where I'm living at the moment, it's a pretty warm place, and we start to see mortality increasing at around 30 degrees. But if you head down south to beautiful Tasmania, we start to see mortality increasing a little bit lower at around 26 degrees. So Tasmania is much colder. It's a bit like New Zealand. It's it gets very chilly in Tasmania. It does also now these days start to get hot as well. But obviously people in Queensland up north, where it's warmer, have some level of physiological, behavioural and structural adaptations that they've made to cope with heat. Now, some similarities between Malta and Australia if we're talking about extreme weather, so both are highly urbanised, exposed to heat extremes. Rainfall variability I've thrown in here as well, because I understand that there's been some, in Malta you're experiencing drought and experiencing floods as well, so we might want to keep that in mind. Both countries relatively wealthy with good infrastructure, high burden of chronic disease often related to obesity, and an ageing population. Okay, so one of the key ways of just sort of seeing how well we are actually adapted and how well we're coping with heat extremes is how well the health system can actually manage with what's going on. So its infrastructure as well as its personnel, for example. Can it cope with sudden increases in demand and the physical challenges that might be there in the environment? And can it cope with a sustained change pattern? So we've got changes in averages, and we've got those extreme events that occur. So if we're managing those well, then that could be considered to be a sign of successful adaptation. So what makes a well-adapted health system? Well, one that's actually accessible to the most vulnerable people. As I mentioned, if you're less mobile, for example, during a heat wave, it's actually you're at greater risk. So so if you have a health system that somehow those less mobile people can have access to in some ways, that would be helpful. A health system that's flexible, so is it able to provide multiple types of services, for example, when required? It needs to be strategic in how it allocates resources, and it needs to prioritise vulnerable populations because they're the ones that are at greatest risk. Needs to be robust, physically robust, have resilient infrastructure, particularly if you're talking about flooding in Australia, and making sure that those health services don't shut down during those times, or that it's got its particular power supplies, for example. Now this is probably what I think this would be the most important slide of today. So if there's one thing I want you to think about when you leave today. It's about how the health system isn't actually just the health system. It's everything that goes into to what happens and how we respond. So a number of systems, if you like, different systems are involved during extreme events and how well our health system copes. So obviously we've got the climate system. We can't do much about that apart from mitigation that has longer term effects. So take that one as a given. We have the urban system. So this includes things like transport, communication, how power is generated, what the built environment is like, whether there's access to cool spots and green spaces for people. And then we have the social system. So how well connected are people? How well are we looking after each other? So those different sorts of systems are all essential when you're starting to think about how we cope with climate change and extreme events and its impacts on our health. So I'm going to focus just for a moment on the urban system, just to give you a sense of things that we can and can't change. So if we're still thinking about extreme heat in an urban area, there are some things that we can't actually change. We can't change the heat wave intensity. We can't change what's the climate that's actually hitting the city. We can't change the age and health status of the population. And if we're thinking just about the urban system, we can't change what health services are available. But what we can change, we can change the design of our neighbourhoods. So we can think about how densely populated neighbourhoods are, how walkable they are, whether people have footpaths to walk on if they're able to move around, whether there's shade, public space, whether there's mixed-use neighbourhoods, which are shown to be the ones that are actually quite protective, for example, during heat waves when you've got lots of people about. And whether people are looking out for each other as well. You get that from mixed-use neighbourhoods as well. People start to have a bit of a sense of what's going on and who's where. We can also change our buildings, what sorts of materials we build out of, their orientation and their quality. Now that's actually one thing Australia has got completely wrong over the years. We're terrible at building houses that are suitable for the climates in which we live. Whereas I think in Malta you've done pretty well with your really thick stone. Things tend to keep quite cool. So we build houses out of cardboard back home. So yeah, very, very much cardboard houses, which is good for the cooling down at night time if you do get that cool nighttime minimum. So you can change outdoor temperature exposure. And one way, have any of you heard of the urban heat island effect? Yeah. So this idea that the sun beats down on an urban area during the day, and it's actually hotter in an urban area than it is in an adjacent green space area, for example, because the buildings absorb the heat. And they tend to stay hot during the evenings as well. We can also change indoor temperature exposure. We can change energy use, how we use air conditioning, for example. Public transport, how that's organised. We can increase people's physical activity if people take public transport rather than drive their cars everywhere. And we can change how accessible it is for people to actually get around, to get to health services when they need it. So there are things we can change and there are things we can't change. And all of these, if you like, are much part of the broader health system. Now this is another key point that I want to make as well, is that when we're planning for climate change and planning to make these differences, what we can do is we look for what are called co-benefits. And these are things that bring a benefit over and above any relation to climate change. So things that benefit population health as a whole. So public transport, as I mentioned, is one good example. If you have good public transport system, you cut down on the emissions from personal vehicles, and you're also getting a healthier population because people tend to be a little bit more physically active when they're using public transport. And one of the best things you can do if you want to have a well-adapted population for climate change is to have a healthy population. So just a little brief introduction to systems here before I get you to do some work. The idea of a system is it sort of shows the relationships of how things are connected. So if you increase one thing, does that lead to an increase in another thing or a decrease in another thing? And you get this, there's this sort of framework, if you like, of positive feedback loops and negative feedback loops. So an example that I've got there, just to give you an idea of how that works, if we start off with greenhouse gas emissions in the middle, we can say that that has a positive feedback loop in terms of surface temperature, because if you increase greenhouse gas emissions, you increase surface temperature, and that actually increases greenhouse gas emissions if you're talking about methane being released from permafrost, for example. So that would be a positive feedback loop. A negative feedback loop would be thinking about, okay, we've got greenhouse gas emissions, we introduce a carbon price, and that in turn decreases greenhouse gas emissions. So that gives you the negative feedback loop. So I just want you to, you're not going to be tested on this, don't worry, but it's but just the idea that it's non-linear, that you can make a change in a particular area and that leads to changes in other areas that may or may not be proportional to the change that you're making. So if we've got a few minutes, I wanted to get a bit of a discussion going about health system adaptation in Malta and the sorts of things that you think feed into the system that makes a difference to health outcomes in Malta. So you can think about, like if you want to choose extreme heat, that was the example I had here, you could think about flooding, for example. You could think about food security. So I thought we could just get a little bit of a discussion happening. I've got some examples there about what might happen, what might be useful to think about in terms of heat. And with the fancy names of nodes and edges, don't worry too much about that. If you think about the variables that are important and just how they're related to other variables as well, as to whether they're positively or negatively related, that kind of thing. And if, you know, throw in some ideas as well. So we do have a board to write on. Or if someone would like, do we have 5 minutes? Is that all right?
Yes.
Oh, 2? Okay, well maybe just throw some ideas to me about things that that are important in Malta if you're thinking about sort of broader systems rather than health systems, just health services systems. I heard a lot about traffic yesterday. So, transport? Yeah. Do we want to talk about heat or flood or?
Well, I think in the case of transport, it would be affected by, you could say, even flooding, for example.
Yep.
The country comes to a gridlock.
Okay.
So how does that impact health systems, for example?
All right. Shall we go with John's example? We'll have a quick chat about flooding. Flooding in Malta and transport, certainly one variable. Everything comes to a halt. So what sorts of things would you need to think about if you wanted to make sure that people who needed to access healthcare during a flood, what sorts of things would you need to make sure would happen, or what would you change?
Given that we have some areas which are quite high and some areas where we have the valleys, and the valleys are interconnected, we want to look after the people in those valleys because those are the worst hit.
Okay.
So you're looking at access to health and to any other kind of emergency services for those people particularly, because there will be a big difference, a big equality issue.
Okay. Can you all hear up the back from? So that was about looking after people in the valleys in particular. My question is, where are your major health services located in Malta? Are they on high ground? Are they on low ground? Are they at risk from flooding?
I think one of the problems is that they're very centralized, you could say. The main system is the hospital just here. So perhaps one could adapt by increasing the services at the local clinics, for example, or the health centres. So empowering them to be able to adapt to such an emergency service.
So a bit of decentralising?
Yes,
Perhaps?
yes. But we've overbalanced our health services towards secondary care hospital. We've created a super hospital where everyone wants to go there, and then we haven't, to the same tune, we haven't supported primary care, and so the end result is an over-flooded secondary care system and an under-supported primary care system.
So
we need to change the balance of it.
So if something happened to that hospital in particular,
Exactly.
there'd be a big problem. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Also having alert systems, because with predictions of what could happen, that will also try to mitigate as much the impact, and also have the people alerted to what could be the situation, and also divert them to where they can possibly go for care. Preempt also the services which may be required within the health centres, which would be more closer to the community.
Okay. So an early warning system that would trigger a set of responses to be able to manage.
Population informed and prepared for it. So if you need this, like rather than everyone trying to go to the main hospital altogether, leading to more traffic and everything, and then direct them to where they should be going, like also perhaps divert the stuff to more the health centres where you actually need them.
Which raises another critical variable, if you like, which is communication. You know, how you would actually disseminate that information. It looks like I need to finish up, so I'll do that. But look, I'm happy to continue this discussion a little bit afterwards if anyone wants to go on. But I think the main point I wanted to make, and this comes to, you know, thinking about how we sort of envision our future, if you like. You know, these are things that we do need to do. We need to make these changes. And how much change you want to make is kind of dependent on you know, how many climate casualties you're willing to accept, I suppose. So, you know, at this point we know that we're already getting climate change casualties in Australia and elsewhere, and it's a matter of trying to minimise those. So anyway, thank you very much for your interest and your time today.
So, Hilary, thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to ask the member of the panelists to come over, please, and to have a seat there. And Hilary, that includes yourself, please. Yes, please. We're going to have a very quick, round of comments. Starting with, let me get the program so I introduce everybody in the correct manner. So first of all, thank you once again to have accepted to come to our discussion. This is a follow-up on Hilary's presentation, so there are going to be some very, pointed questions, but feel free, of course, to react to any of the points that were raised. Let's start with Dr. Julian Mamos, a senior lecturer and the head of Department of Public Health and Faculty of Medicine and Surgery here at the University of Malta. I would like to ask you, first of all, of course, to react freely to any of the points raised in the presentation. But I would like to ask you, in terms of the research being conducted from the public health point of view, if there is any awareness among both the scientific community as well as the community at large, mostly policymakers, in relation to some of the current risks that Malta is facing or is about to face increasingly more. So is there this awareness in terms of these specific impacts? And I'll ask you to speak on the mic, please.
Thank you very much. In terms of awareness, I think this has been, let's say, growing over the last years, probably more so since we joined the EU. I think the EU has been a big trigger here for our sensitivity to the environment, to the climate change issue, and to our preparedness in general. With regard to our, shall we say, our medical personnel or our public health trainees, I think the idea of climate change and health issues, especially public health issues, have been more recent. And I think two of our main proponents for environmental health and are actually on this panel with us here. So those are our public health people who are very much, the newer generation, very much coming out with what we really need to do and starting off some important research. I mean, John himself has done quite a bit, and Roberto has done that even at undergraduate level. So we have seen some great initiatives from these two persons here. But also we do lack, I think, a wider net. I think we have a few people very, very interested, very aware, others less so. Of course, this is a small island. There are lots of different issues. Many of us multitask, so we have different hats. And you are inevitably in an island like ours. You have so many different things that you are less of a specialist and more of a generalist.
But we are having some specialists in environmental health, and we're very, very happy for that. If I can shift to some of the things that Hilary mentioned, I really enjoyed the discussion on the similarities, and I began to think of the differences between Malta and Australia, not least the size, but also the fact that many Maltese are there, and probably they may even have more Maltese there than we have here. It depends how they reproduce over there. We're not so sure about that. But there are other issues. But then some of the differences. The heat, the humidity, maybe those are similar and they're important. Here the heat is really, I think, an issue. The humidity for us, because you feel the heat more and the cold more in this island, which is supposed to be relatively mild, but it's not mild. Ask anyone who comes here from abroad, and they're told that this is a mild winter until they feel it, and they realize that the winter feels much colder than it really seems to be on the temperature scale. And the other issues are the political commitments, the problems we have with everyone being rather blinkered and short-term. It's difficult to persuade the politician who's up for 5 years that something more important than a 5-year term is something we need to think about, And with regard to the preparedness, I like the long list of things we have to think about, and I had some more to think about myself. Industry, importation, taxation, really important, because while we're doing that, we could be preparing for health. In general, not just climate change. We already have problems in this country with obesity. It's a huge phenomenon in this country. And we need to act on industry, importation, taxation, legislation, and perhaps especially enforcement, where we're very, very poor. These are our big issues, which are linked, as Hilary was saying, to our preparedness for climate change, but also to the current climate we have with obesity, which is continuing to grow and continuing to cause big problems with diabetes and heart disease. But the big difference with Australia is a political one, and their great independence and our great, perhaps, being part of the EU, but that has helped us, I think, so far, and it's up to us to try and take that further. I'm very glad that this small island states organization here has started the ball rolling, and you yourselves have done a great job, yourself and Simone. So I think that's the good news, but this is all very recent, and we need to get more on board, I think. This is one of our challenges at the moment in Malta, to get more people on board, to look at things in this broader perspective, to think long term where our politicians will not go.
Thank you very much. I would like to please pass on the microphone. I know that you have some further commitments, including a class to attend, so thank you very much for coming and for participating. Now, I'd like to thank Dr. Charmaine Gauci for attending this event and for staying with us. Dr. Gauci is the Superintendent of Public Health, so I'm very glad to have you here discussing here with us. What I would like to ask you is very much in line with what we've been hearing from Julian. In terms of, I'd like to push on the button of awareness. Now, you've been championing some of the issues that we know nowadays are also at the center of this debate. What are the real challenges when it comes to implementation? Is it a matter of budget? Is it a matter of not enough awareness or attention from the people who work also in the field? And if there is any element or incentive, including other instruments you have available within the ministry, that could make a difference in terms of the risk coming from climate change?
Thank you. It's a true pleasure to be invited here, and I really it's a pleasure to have listened to your presentation, and also yesterday was a great event to see so many people getting together. And climate change, similarly to various other issues that we have around us, including what Julian has actually mentioned, obesity, are what's happening around us globally and also what's happening in various countries. And we see that this problem cannot be tackled by one category only. So we see that it has an impact on health, but it has impacts on various other institutions and the whole lives of every day of every person. So when we are developing our strategies for adaptation, for mitigation, we need to see the broad concept and try to take the variable risk factors that we are seeing and get it all together. This is basically what even the World Health Organization looks in tackling non-communicable diseases. So just, for example, if we're looking at heart diseases, if we're looking at cancers, if we're looking at musculoskeletal, at respiratory diseases, we know that there are various factors, like, for example, smoking, diet-related conditions. These, if you tackle these factors, then you will be tackling the number of conditions. And similarly with climate change. So if we try to get all together, if we're targeting transport, which is creating various issues, if we're getting lots of cars being used, lots of emissions, worsening climate change, car use is also a problem for increasing our weight and obesity. So what I'm getting at is we have various issues that we're seeing in our day-to-day life, which is affecting not only climate change, but other various factors. So this is the concept of getting everyone together, getting all government entities together, and getting the whole of society approach. And when I'm talking about whole of society, it means the industry need to play a part here. We need to have the NGOs play a part, and this is really good because in environment we do have a lot of NGOs. If you talk about other conditions, we may not have, for example, for obesity, we don't have an NGO in Malta, okay, even though it's a big problem. So why can't we more get together and each one of us do our part? And when we're talking about climate change and we're talking about adaptation to climate change, I like to link it as well clearly to what we do in prevention, in primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. So if you look at primary prevention, in prevention of diseases, we try to prevent a disease before it's happening. In adaptation to climate change, what do? We try to reduce the exposures, right? So reducing exposures, for example, by means of legislative measures, by means of alterations in the built environment, by means of alterations in the urban environment. This is all prevention. In diseases, we do secondary prevention. So you have a condition, you have diabetes, you have obesity, so you try from getting it worse. What do we do with climate change? We get early warning systems, okay, to get it, to know about it as early as possible. We do surveillance and monitoring. Vector control problems. You asked the question about, do people know about climate change? Well, they surely got to know about Zika. Who doesn't know about Zika in here? Okay, and mosquitoes. So it was a big, on every day in our news on Zika. Why? Because everyone was afraid because Zika can cause fetal malformation, and that's really bad when you look at a baby with a small head. Okay, but little did they know what was causing this. Okay. So vector control programs, and the same with tertiary prevention, whereby we have the same adaptation measures into medical training of health professionals and other professionals, treatment, etc. So why can't we get all these global issues that we're having, the issues which are particular to specific situations, and even more specific to small states whereby we are really dependent on other countries, and what we can do in Malta can do such impact, but if we get all together we can have much bigger impacts and take it through a whole of government and whole of society approach to really make an impact.
Thank you very much. Hilary, I would like to ask you to wait to have all the feedback from the audience so that you can play all your ammunition later on, right? And give your feedback later. So, Dr. John Paul Gauki from Franklin Bear Hire. However, I know that you also have a research position currently with another NGO coming from the world of NGOs. I'm very much interested to know if you feel that there is enough connection between what are the main issues being raised by civil societies, organized citizens, as well as all the others, and the response that one would expect from public institutions, particularly in this case, public health services, when it comes to those risks highlighted in the presentation and the discussion in relation to climate change, so floods or when heat wave comes, and we had recently some examples of these two, or others that you would like to highlight. So is there any of this, of the response or expectations are being met?
Expectations being met, that's a bit of a statement. No, basically I think what we're having is a sort of development in the civil society in Malta especially. We're seeing far more as civil society, NGOs and people in general, the connection between things. So we realize increasingly that traffic is not just a problem because we're stressed and we arrive late at work, but because it is having an impact on our health, it's having an impact on emissions, it's having an impact on our climate, on our environment. So civil society in general is seeing the connectedness of things, you could say, as regards these challenges we're facing. When it comes to governmental institutions, very often they're very sort of, okay, this is my area and I'm not going to overstep on this other area. So it might be a health issue, but when you tell them, listen, it's an environmental health issue, there's a sort of reluctance, no, I don't want to step on the environment minister's toes. And then the environment minister says, I don't want to step into the health issue. So while civil society in general is recognizing more the connection of things and problems, to build more resilient communities at the end of the day, I think from a governmental level, there's less of I wouldn't say awareness, I would say will, perhaps. Perhaps one needs to have more, you could say, ministerial communication on this level. I'll give you an example. Hilary mentioned about construction, for example. Our older buildings are far more adapted to our climate than our newer ones. If you look at some of the apartments being built nowadays, they are absolutely horrible for the current climate and let alone future climate. So one could say that there is this disconnect between urban planning, between planning regulations and the actual health impact. Are we seeing the connection between them? There seems to be a disconnect on an institutional or governmental level. Similarly, I'll give you an example with the water relief systems. So recently we had the flood relief systems built in the valleys. Excellent initiative. Why not take the opportunity to capture that water that is being currently thrown into the sea, given that we are one of the top 10 water scarce countries in the world? So you can see there's like, we've tackled the problem, but we could have tackled 2 or 3 problems at the same time, and we just didn't take that extra step. So I think what we need is to look at things holistically and communicate holistically to make a better resilient island at the end of the day. I think that is where NGOs are trying to slowly introduce the concept of, hey, we can, for example, decrease development and construction by looking at the many buildings that are abandoned, because at the end of the day that will improve the aesthetics, help us mental health-wise. So there's that conversation going on within NGOs and between NGOs. But when it comes to government, I think there's a reluctance, and that is our challenge.
Thank you, John. Very clear. Dr. Roberto De Bono, specialist in public health medicine. Thank you once again for being here with us. Do you think there is enough awareness from the public health sphere and doctors or in general people working in the health sector about the consequences and the risks of climate change? Because sometimes it can also be a problem of communicating certain things to all the other people who then access those services.
Thank you, Stefano. First of all, thank you for organizing this, and thanks, Prof. Bambrick, for the excellent presentation. Regarding awareness, I think from a political perspective, we're quite well ahead. I mean, we have a national climate change mitigation strategy. We have a national climate change adaptation strategy, which was endorsed in 2012. We have a climate action bill, which was passed in Parliament in 2015, and the Climate Action Board, which was set up in 2016. So, from that perspective, we're quite well ahead. From a health professional perspective, for example, family doctors have had sessions on climate change and health in the past as part of their training, as part of the training of specialization in family medicine. So, and this has been going on for the past 5 years. Professionals, I think, are aware of climate change. Maybe they're not well aware of the human health effects of climate change, but slowly they're getting there. What about the public? Because, and I want to refer to Dr. Julian Mamos' reference to the research that was done in 2009 at the University of Malta. When we conducted a survey, on a telephone survey on about 550 people in Malta, and what we found out is that those people in the public who perceived climate change as a health problem rather than just an environmental problem, those people who kind of linked climate change to health, were much more willing to take action in favor of climate change mitigation. They were much more in favor of taking public transport, for example. They were much more in favor of walking to nearby amenities. They were much more in favor of adopting renewable energy. And this is an important message, I think, which needs to get through. That when we communicate messages on climate change, we need to strengthen the link to health. And if I may pass on two more points, I would like to borrow a suggestion from yesterday's panel speaker, Dr. Vince Caruana, about visioning, because I really liked that kind of approach, where he kind of appealed to whoever was there, to rather than taking a problem-solving approach, solving one problem at a time, building a vision for in 10, 20 years' time, we build a vision which is climate change friendly, which is good for health, which takes the whole of society approach, the whole of government approach, which takes this kind of connectedness that John Paul was referring to as well. And I think this kind of approach is really required, and because we're so used to taking a problem-solving approach and then getting collateral effects in other ministries maybe or in other areas without even being aware of, that we need to take this kind of setting up a vision, taking an interdisciplinary approach and moving towards that vision. And my last comment, maybe a bit controversial, is that there are many similarities between Australia and Malta. It seems that Australia is vulnerable. It's an island like Malta. It has an aging population. Malta, in addition to that, is small. And this smallness, I think, is an added factor to this vulnerability. We have only one hospital. We have one emergency department. We know all the emergency doctors by name almost. I mean, because they're a handful. If we get an extreme weather event and we get a rise in the number of casualties, then we have a big problem because we don't have a backup hospital somewhere nearby who can assist. So we are really alone in this. And I think there is a limit to how much we can adapt to climate change. So I'm really in favor of climate change adaptation, but there is a limit. And if we look at Australia's case, the asthma case, there were people dying from asthma after the ton, which was really unpredictable. It was a surprise. People dying from asthma. It's really
Can I just clarify that as well? These
Yep.
were people who didn't necessarily have a diagnosis of asthma. Sorry. A lot of the people affected by that thunderstorm asthma event had never had asthma before in their lives, so it was completely out of the blue for them. So.
Thanks for that clarification. So my point is, we need to speak about climate change mitigation along with climate change adaptation. We know that we will have to adapt to climate change, but we need to identify what our role as a small island state and as a vulnerable island state is as a voice for the international community to take action to mitigate climate change as fast and as effectively as possible. Because we are the victims. And that is my last point. Climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation need to go hand in hand. Thanks, Stefan.
Thank you, Roberto. Hilary, before we open the floor, for the questions, any point that you would like to raise in terms of feedback after the points you have just heard? And also wanted to ask you if you wanted to share any perhaps good practice that you've been seeing developed well in Australia in terms of response, perhaps early warning, because you're very good at planning ahead in terms of those risks. Feel free.
Okay, thank you. Look, I'll just pick up very quickly on 2 points that were raised. One is the idea of vision, which I completely agree with, and I think one of the things that we don't do when we're thinking about dealing with climate change, whether it's mitigation or adaptation, we don't think big enough. We don't think about what sort of society we want to live in. So I think, if each of you today, wrote down the words about the type of Malta you want to see, the things that you want to change, and you could even draw those little connecting systems, connecting lines between them, I think you would go a long way to mitigating climate change as well as adapting to climate change, just by thinking about what's the society, what is the type of society I want to live in, what's the environment I want to live in. So that's my first point. My second point is, obviously being a small country is a big problem when you're dealing with something at the scale of climate change. You probably feel quite powerless as well to some degree. Luckily, the European Union is quite strong in this. And I'll mention again what I mentioned yesterday about the tiny Pacific Island countries being able to make such a difference in Paris last year. And that, mosquitoes are very small and they can be very loud and annoying as well. So I think, there is a chance here for Malta to sort of really stand up and shout and to make it known what the issues are for climate change.
Very briefly, I'd like to add to this that Malta was actually the country that proposed to the UN to make the climate the national heritage of mankind. So we did kickstart something long term. It's just that we sort of stepped back from that role, I think, over the years.
Wise words. So I'm going to open the floor for past this one, for some questions. Please just say your name and any other information you'd like to add, and the question if it's directed to one person or the panel. Thank you.
Do I have to use the microphone?
Yes, because we're recording the session, and so it would be better to hear what you're saying.
So my name is Marie Bergoglio. This is a terrible microphone without a delay. I'm an environmental economist. I lecture these students. I'm his wife, and I'm friends with most of you. So I do have a couple of points. The first is a bit controversial. I'm not sure I really believe that we should be tackling mitigation and adaptation together. They are different behaviors associated. There's different key audiences, different sense of urgency, different dimensions of problems. And I think, just like I often say, whenever we're aiming for a solution to something, we need to articulate it clearly with a clear audience, a clear set of messages, propositions, visions, etc. Of course, climate mitigation would reduce the need for climate adaptation. Of course, they are intimately linked at a sort of global. But when it comes to advocating for behavioral change, when it comes for planning of what to do, sometimes what you need to do for climate adaptation, at least in short term, can go against what you need to do for climate adaptation. Of course, there are win-wins, but there are synergies between anything. You take any two activities, you're going to find an intersection. So I'm not sure that strategically, it's just a question that I have. So, should we be tackling the two? Should we give climate adaptation its own rightful discussion? And the second question is, do we have a climate adaptation plan for Malta, costed, budgeted, with key actors identified, who's going to do when, what, Does it take into account our new population structure, and so on and so forth? So.
Can I answer the last question? With that microphone.
Hi. Okay. I would like just to make the linkage with the last question asked by Marie. First of all, I'm Simone Borch. I was the one who introduced this, so I think you know who I am by now. And I thank the panelists for their very interesting comments. I do tend to disagree that we have taken a step back when it comes to climate change in Malta. I'm not saying that we haven't a lot to do yet, but I think that as a state we have done a lot. We, in fact, we were the only developing country who willingly accepted to have reduction targets. I mean, so there are things that we did well. We didn't do everything wrong. However, to answer the question which Marie made, we do have a climate adaptation plan. In fact, Roberto wrote the chapter on health, and we had insisted on including a chapter on health. It wasn't envisaged at first. However, the climate adaptation plan for Malta doesn't go into the economics, and I remember that the chair, who was what's his name, Philip Spiteri-Gingell, who is an economist, had insisted that this adaptation plan, which is more of an administrative adaptation plan, it identifies the main issues, it identifies what we envisage to be the main adaptation needs for Malta. He had made a huge argument that it needs to be backed up by a real cost analysis, because at the end of the day, this is what it's all about. And then you have to see which options you have. You look at each option with the costs and see which is the one that is most suitable. With adaptation, there are some merits in linking them. Actually, you have to link them to some extent. However, they have to be tackled differently, because mitigation involves, for example, mainly the Ministry for Energy, the Ministry for Transport, whereas adaptation is really much wider than that. And in fact, for example, health features predominantly in the adaptation aspect. You need to have the linkages, because as far as possible, you cannot take adaptation measures which will increase your emissions, you know, like the brilliant idea that you can compete with the heat, the extra heat, by installing more air conditioners. It doesn't make adaptation sense for climate. However, obviously, the linkages must be there. With respect to what we are doing, I think to criticize what we haven't done, I think we have tackled it a bit in fits and starts. There is a lot of impetus, but we hold reports and then they get forgotten for a little bit, then we dust a bit from them, and then we revise them. One understands that climate in itself, unfortunately, it's something that politicians tend to look at it as something for the future, or rather not an imminent emergency. Thankfully, the EU requires member states to establish progress which is sort of scaled up, and there are target dates, interim target dates, like the 2020 targets. We've missed some interim targets, but at least we are getting there. I think the biggest problem with adaptation in Malta would be water management. I think, and it is a problem which we already have and which we're not giving it the attention it deserves. That is what I had to say. Sorry for taking so long.
Thank you. Any more questions before we pass, or observations or curiosities to ask before we go back to the panel? So, at you, if you have anything else, so please feel free to, I will start with Mr. Gauci, start to put some feedback. Yes, thank you.
I think from the health aspect, we sometimes even health professionals themselves don't think so much about the causes of certain diseases as well. For example, when we are talking about, for example, cancers, okay? Most of the times we're talking about prevention, but the focus, even politically, many times is investing more money into treatment, okay? So, I mean, just listen to the news, what hits the charts and the news when we talk about cancers. 2 new cancer drugs introduced in the national formulary. And my heart aches because we know there is so many other things that we can really do and have an impact. When sometimes some of us who may have a relative in our family, we wouldn't like that we're just prolonging life, and yet this could have been prevented. We know that 40% of cancers can be prevented. And climate change does have an impact on cancers. Just one simple thing. We know that UV radiation can cause cancer. Malta has increasing numbers of melanoma, which is a type of skin cancer caused by radiation, UV radiation. And yet, what do we see? Okay? We see more investment into treatments. So this is what's happening and what's mainly hitting the media. And I see this as well as a bit of a false perception of need from the population. Because we know that political agenda is many times driven by what the population is asking for. And yet we perhaps are failing at actually informing the people what is their actual needs. So this is, I think, an area whereby we can link what we are seeing in our population, what is the biggest need, and link it to all the exposures that we have, and perhaps not put climate change on high top agenda in itself, but put all the issues that we have in our countries, and let's not compete with issues that we have between each other, if you know what I'm trying to get at.
Well, of course there are links between climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation. But I agree that strategically we need to separate them. I mean, climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. But to take one example, for example, the healthcare sector is one of the biggest polluters of climate change in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And on the other hand, having a strong healthcare sector is important for climate change adaptation. A water-scarce country, we produce 57% or more of our potable water by desalinating plants. That's a polluting type of activity. And on the other hand, to adapt, we need to ensure that everybody has potable water, safe potable water in his or her taps. And we know that projections probably will be that rainfall maybe will decrease. Precipitation patterns have changed for sure. We have more rains on less days. So flooding events, you have more runoff and more waste of water, and less recharge of the groundwater table possible. I think that's my point, but strategically I agree. I mean, climate change mitigation, it's more a visionary thing. When we need to vision climate change adaptation, where we need to imagine one picture of Malta, and we need to imagine one picture of the global society, which we are part of as well, the European society and the global society, where we want to get. And we need to factor in every aspect, both climate change adaptation, both climate change mitigation, and all the other priorities that we have. Thanks.
Just while we're talking about mitigation and adaptation, just a point you might be interested in is that 20 years ago, when I started working on climate change and health, adaptation was a dirty word. So we didn't even consider adaptation at all. It was all about mitigation. And this was because of the idea that we didn't expect to actually, or we certainly didn't want to get to a point where we would require adaptation. So that changed probably about a bit over 15 years ago when we realised that actually we really needed to start thinking about adaptation because climate change was actually happening. There was warming in the pipeline, if you like, and that we would be seeing these effects. And I think what's become more and more clear over recent years is that we really are seeing those effects, and they're happening sooner than we expected. And so adaptation has kind of taken over, if you like, as sort of in the public health discourse.
Three small comments. First of all, a small clarification. When I said that Malta stepped back from the climate role, I meant more in the terms of, you could say, being the voice for a cause, in a sense, on the international scale. It would be very interesting to see Malta, for example, taking a more vocal role for small island states, especially given that we are in the EU. We could have that platform to speak on. My second point being about mitigation and adaptation, what we're talking about. I think there are some, not all, but some areas that can really be tackled by both. I'll give you an example. We keep thinking more and more about, talking more and more about Malta being an obesogenic environment. So we say that as a country, you know, we're the fattest people on earth, laziest people on earth, whatever, you know. I don't know how scientific these studies are, but clearly obesity is a huge problem in Malta. As a way of mitigating climate change, you know, we could encourage people to walk, to cycle, to use better means of public transport and so on. And it is also, however, an adaptation measure, because when you have a problem with infrastructure, when we're saying that if it rains, the entire country comes to a gridlock and perhaps you have health problems as a result of that because ambulances can't reach the centralized hospital, what you can do is encourage people to, you know, as a mitigation measure, becomes also an adaptation measure. Because you are encouraging people not to use their cars, and therefore it indirectly becomes a mitigation measure. So I think we need to look at that sort of narrative as regards climate change, adaptation and mitigation measures, with the cost benefits possibly coming from in both sectors. And also another thing I would encourage all of the people here to do is to perhaps look at this as an opportunity. You know, we have this climate change threat over there and also over here. You know, we're in it and it's going to get worse. So why not push for a vision to start looking at? You know, we're talking about the need for holistic approach to all things. Why not perhaps become more vocal? Perhaps encourage the country to become more visionary and therefore tackle things all across the board. It's sort of, I get a feeling coming from the NGO sector, we're very good at complaining, but I always say we're the servants of complacency and masters of complaint. If we do not also start talking about these things and actively participating, I think we'll just remain stuck as groaning about things, whereas we have an opportunity ahead here, and I think we should take it.
Thank you, John. So I would like to ask you if there is any more question or observations, or you have any curiosity. Yes. Okay, so I'm gonna pass on this. While this happens, I would like to remind just as a couple of points in terms of one of the aspects that was touched, in the costs associated to adapting, as well as, you know, the risk and the impacts of climate change. So I was trying to retrieve this information, which we have addressed some months ago. So there were many reports, particularly from the WHO and some very key scholars. Haynes is one of them. So they estimated that, for example, moving towards an WHO and Mediterranean diet would cut greenhouse gases by 40%. We're not talking about cutting meat 100% and becoming vegetarian. Just slowly, gradually moving towards a Mediterranean diet would cut 40% greenhouse gas emissions. Another interesting point was for example, shifting towards and doubling walking and biking time would save 25 billion euros only in Europe per year. So these are huge numbers, which perhaps either are not communicated well within the policy making field, or perhaps we still don't have the right instruments to be able to implement this. So perhaps the fact that the mic is going to Marie, an economist who works on these things, can, maybe you can react to this as well?
Yeah.
You have it?
I'm going to draw a parallel from what happened with waste a few years ago in Malta. So before we started tackling the waste problem, many of us, perhaps not the younger ones, will remember driving past Malta and having to hold our noses. It stank. It was huge, it burnt, it caught fire. But I remember writing an article in the Times, which I called, I Love Matap. And the reason is that it was the best communication campaign about the impacts of waste that anybody could possibly do. It wasn't on a brochure, it wasn't in terms of euro and costs, it was the actual thing, which stank and caused damage. How much better could it be to have the actual thing to persuade people that waste is a problem, right? Of course, it was far too late and so forth. But the parallel is that we now actually have climate change working for us. So we can actually tell people it's not something that's going to happen far, far away. We actually have the problems. And that's why I think that climate adaptation is a much easier thing to sell than climate mitigation. It's much easier for people to envisage what climate change is about. When we show them, this is what, like Hillary's pictures, this is what we're talking about. And that's why I think that climate adaptation is a much easier agenda. And strategically, we need to be pushing there. It is more short-term, it is more reactionary, but we've run out of time. We have to start tackling this. And it's thanks to this, just like thanks to MATAP, we managed to get action. Well, let me be honest, it was thanks to the European Union that we got action, but also thanks to the fact that we did have that monument, of our inefficiency. Now we have these monuments of floods, weather change, and so forth. It's thanks to pushing that agenda, and climate mitigation can hang on the tail end of that. But adaptation, I feel, should be really what we're talking about right now. Even for strategically, not to forget mitigation, but it's a much easier topic to talk about. I'm not sure if you agree, Hillary, especially since you mentioned that flip that happened in Australia. Nobody would talk about adaptation in the EU either. When I was focal point for Malta for the UNFCCC, all I said was adaptation, 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 adaptation. Nobody wanted to listen to it because it was far away, they thought.
I agree with what Marie said, and definitely that the EU is still quite reluctant to discuss adaptation for the reason that it involves loss and damage, and it gives it shivers to discuss adaptation. Thankfully, however, that changed a bit when Connie Hedegaard towards the end of her term, and I would say that Malta was one of the states that kept pushing for adaptation, because for us, it's going to be more of an adaptation issue than a mitigation, because our contribution to the global emissions is minimal. I definitely don't want to give the impression that we are doing everything there should be done at all. We still have a long way to go. And I think that the best way to make governments really react with respect to adaptation is to tell them, the laws are already there, because in reality, if you had to implement and ensure compliance with the number of laws that we have on health, on environment, on this and that, you would be already adapting a great deal. If we had to implement the Water Framework Directive, we're already protecting our waters. So it's already there. It's not something, there could be more fine-tuning, but it's already there. And I do agree that, in fact, adaptation is what is closer to the grassroots rather than mitigation. Mitigation is mainly the role of governments, or rather the role of the big companies that generate energy or generate transport systems, etc. It's adaptation that will actually affect us as individuals. Thanks.
Thank you, Simone. You actually covered most of what I was about to say, but I'll just re-emphasise a couple of things. So yeah, I can see that in a country the size of Malta with the emissions that you have, mitigation isn't really a high priority because you're not a high emitting country relative, for example, to Australia. In Australia, we're a very high emitting country, and I can tell you that there are lots and lots of people working at grassroots level to bring down emissions, to stop coal exports, to stop new coal mines being opened, for example. So, and at the same time, we also have to have the adaptation conversation in Australia.
Final point, yeah?
With respect to climate change mitigation, I tend to agree with Prof. Bambrick. There are European movements as well. They call it degrowth movements, for example. There are protests against economic growth. There are post-growth movements. There are a-growth movements. There are all kinds of movements challenging the current economic models, which are based on cheap energy, it's still cheap, comparatively cheap energy in the form of fossil fuels. So I tend to think that we need to focus both on climate change adaptation, the firefighting, and the preventive aspect of climate change adaptation, which requires proper risk assessments and preparations and climate change mitigation as well. I mean, I think we need to keep both in the focus. I don't know which one is most politically palatable, to sell. It may be climate change adaptation. If an extreme weather event hits Malta, then climate change adaptation will rise very high up the political agenda. As long as extreme weather events are confined to Australia or to somewhere far away, I don't think there will be public support for climate change adaptation that much. But that's my personal opinion.
One small point as regards the adaptation conversation. We talk about adaptation, but in fact, when you look at, I don't want to be criticizing any government, for this thing, but the fact is, the conversation in Malta is very much about develop. One case that goes flat in the face of climate change adaptation is the conversation on reclamation, land reclamation. So we are talking about sea level rise that is, at this point, to some degree, inevitably going to happen. But the conversation is, let's put stones in the sea, so we'll build on them. I think that is an extremely short-sighted vision that we're having. We're seeing we can make quick money from this, but in 50 years' time, if that plot of land we've built, besides the ecological damage, of course, that plot of land you've built is going to be flooded, what vision are you having? So again, this is where I really encourage the young generations here, do be vocal. We have this vision we can draw. Let's draw it and let's say, listen, this goes against the very policies you're talking about. So why are you doing this? So,
Charles, yes, I know you're going to be very quick. So yes, I am sure.
My name is Charles Gaddis. I come from the Institute of Earth Systems. I teach climate change, but also aspects concerning meteorology and especially extreme events, the genesis of extreme events. And we do some studies as well concerning the historic climate change, and we look at trends. One aspect which I'm really interested in is the early warning, and you've mentioned that rightly so, Dr. Gauci, how important the early warning system is for even at a national level, let alone a local level. Unfortunately, here in Malta, it's quite fragmentary. It's there. I don't think it has been tested well enough, but it's there. It's there for temperature extremes, so heat waves. It's there also for high UVIs, ultraviolet indices. We recently also carried out some testing to see how we can predict extreme convective events early enough and how to perhaps tailor some models in this respect. I have a question for you, Professor Bambrick. What have been the lessons learned with regards to the infrastructure that is needed? Is it a very an expensive infrastructure that is needed, or perhaps Malta can start looking at a very economic way to start with regards to early warning systems, and then perhaps mimic some other systems, national systems, that are suitable for the Maltese islands?
Thank you very much for your question. I'll just make a few comments to start with, and then I'll see if I can try to actually answer your question. One thing that strikes me about Malta, obviously, compared with Australia, is the size. So if we're talking about Malta having an early warning system for a particular event, you're going to be needing to rely on external monitoring systems as well, is my guess. So I imagine communication between Malta and other countries for what might be ahead probably has to be even better than generally for Australia, although most of ours happens on the coast. So, but we might get a bit more of a warning just because we have more land, with more monitoring systems on it. So I imagine that could be quite a challenge for Malta. That wouldn't necessarily be a similar challenge in Australia.
It's there, it exists already.
Yeah, so, okay. The second sort of response is, in Australia, we're very good at early warnings for, well, it depends how early you call early. So we get severe storm warnings often at the point in which they're about to happen. So, in fact, I've been standing at my front door with waves of water, going horizontally across, and then my phone beeps and says, "Oh yeah, there's a severe storm on the way." It's like, I think I can see that. So we're not actually that good necessarily all the time at these things, and we also tend to be a little bit overcautious sometimes. So you might get a severe storm warning. And then it doesn't eventuate, and so people become complacent. So that's actually one of the really big issues that we have, is to make sure that we hit the mark most of the time. And I'm not a meteorologist, I don't know what they feed into the system, and we do tend to be very risk averse in Australia, so I imagine that that's going to continue. And if we didn't do that and a severe storm happened and people didn't know about it, they left their car out and it got hailed on, I imagine there'd be a lot of very unhappy people, and that's a little "why didn't you tell me" kind of thing. So we haven't got the system right. I mean, obviously we're going to get it wrong sometimes, and it's a matter of getting it right most of the time. With severe heat waves, we tend to be able to predict them quite a bit in advance. Even a week or two in advance, we know that something big is going to happen. So people do get a chance to kind of prepare. And I mean, one of our favourite pastimes in Australia is grumbling about the weather. So, it gives us something else to talk about over in the tea room. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I can really quite answer your question, but to sort of think about those sorts of challenges that we have. We don't have an early warning system for dengue outbreaks, for example. We have a good surveillance system in place, and so we can pick it up when it starts to occur, when we start to get the outbreak, and that triggers systems, control systems, mosquito control systems. But it's not like we can look several months in advance yet and say it's going to necessarily be a big season for dengue. We usually, once we start to get the wet weather, is when we sort of say, oh yeah, it might be a big season for mosquitoes. So we're not there yet, and it's certainly something we can improve on.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I would like to, unless of course there are other comments, I would like to close the seminar by highlighting a couple of points. First of all, thanking everybody for taking part to this initiative. So I think we've been seeing in the last years interest and research growing exponentially here at University of Malta, and also in the like Ministry of Health and in other public institutions about climate change. This is, this seminar and the same existence of our platform is the, is the example of this. We would like to encourage all of you and to, follow up on any of the points that you have heard today, also in terms of a possible stimulus for, an undergrad or a postgrad or any other type of research you'd like to do in these areas. We started to have, for some time now, a very good level of expertise. We can offer, state-of-the-art research, and the work that also Charles and all the others at the Institute are doing is marvelous in terms of, the physical science. follow up the activities of our climate change platform. We tend to also involve you as much as possible, actually sometimes arrest you, to come and participate in our initiative. I'd like to thank once again all the guests and the speakers, particularly Professor Bambrick, came a long way to participate, and all the others, thank you once again. Hopefully this will be the first of a series of other events in this area. Now I'll ask you to join us for small refreshments. We have some once little stairs to go down, but it's very close, so please come and join us, and thank you very much.